Now, I guess it's easy to get distracted by numbers. What really matters, I hope, are the patients. I, like many of you, love the NHS, but sometimes it's fair to say the care doesn't meet the high standards we've come to expect, and people suffer. One of those was Mathew Hulbert. Jackie, a pensioner, a mum of 3 and a grandmother of 6, had a fall in a Leicestershire home at 2 a.m. on July the 10th last year. Her son Mathew arrived home 3 hours later and immediately called an ambulance, but was told they were extremely busy. At 4:30 p.m, my friends, over 11 hours after that first 999 call, an ambulance finally arrived to take her to hospital, where she tragically died 2 days later from an infection. I'm delighted to say her son Mathew joins me now. Matt, so appreciate you being here. Can't imagine what you've been through. Let me ask you this. How many times did you call 999?
So a number of times throughout the day. It was the one thing that you felt you had the power to do during those dreadful 11 hours when my mum was in such a undignified position on her bedroom floor. The one thing you felt you had the power to do was to call 999 again and say, look, my mum is still in this position. Yes, I appreciate she's breathing, but she's in a dire state, is clearly not well. When is an ambulance going to arrive? And we called for an ambulance at 5 a.m. and a paramedic finally arrived at 4 p.m, 11 hours later.
There she is, lying, as you said, on her bedroom floor. You, her son, trying desperately to do the right thing. I've been in that position once myself. And whilst at that moment you understand that the pressure, and it's not the person in the call centre or even the ambulance drivers, we can talk about every reason. It's desperate, isn't it? What sort of things were you saying? She's dying. I need help here.
Absolutely. And the fact was, though, that she was breathing. And so I appreciate she wasn't an absolute emergency. But clearly, there was something very wrong with her. She died 2 days later after an infection turned to sepsis.
Did you think at that moment when you were saying, I mean, of course, it's the archetypal question, is she breathing? Yes, she is. All right, then we'll put you back 10 hours. I mean, did you imagine this would lead to her death? Do you blame the NHS for her death?
I blame the system. I think the system is broken. I think the system, whether it be the NHS or social care, isn't working as it should. And families like my own, people like my mum, are losing their lives as a result. And so ultimately, Jeremy, the people in charge of the system are the government. That's just the fact of the matter.
There's no doubt that the NHS, and over the next hour we'll talk about it, it's very easy. People jump up and down and they say the NHS isn't fit for purpose. The truth is it was never set up for a population that is as old as it is, and for the sheer numbers. Yeah. But I always go back to people like your mum, like my mum and my dad, who have now sadly passed, and think they paid in all their lives. They bought into this dream, and they've seen this NHS that they've supported emotionally and financially fail them. And that leaves a bitter taste, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And you've said it right. The NHS is, in a way, the epitome of the British dream. And the British dream has let down my mum and so many others. I'm only 44. I think that's quite young to have lost both of my parents. And, I could now face the next 30, or will have to face however long I have left, without them. And I still have times where I want to call my mum and say, got some exciting news or a bit sad about this. And I can't do that. And she was, I know we all talk positively about our parents, most of us, but she was a really good person. You saw there her wonderful smile, a wonderful grandmother. Her grandkids miss her so much. And it was devastating, Jeremy. I'll never forget the indignity of those 11 hours. They're seared in my mind.
I think that's the word, isn't it? The indignity. And we'll talk again later. And I know you'll stay and have a listen about, our paramedics who are up against it. They're not responsible for wait times, and they get abused and they get physical and verbal threats every time they're out there. But people like your mum, who did everything all of her life for everybody else, and you used the phrase undignified, on her bedroom floor, waiting for the very basic help that the whole idea of the NHS was set up to provide. Just very quickly, difficult. I know you've been a counsellor. I know you've got quite strong views. Is it just money? Because the big debate in this country, gets 153 billion as it stands, is it's not just money, it's also mismanagement of that money. Where do you stand on this, having tragically lost somebody because of part of the NHS failing you?
Well, it's money and it's reform. And we definitely need reform in the social care system as well as in the NHS, because both parts link together. And it was because of both parts failing that my mum was left on her bedroom floor for more than 11 hours. I'll never forget it.
Matthew, really, really appreciate you being here. A very difficult thing, and my love to you and your family. Thank you for coming. And as I said earlier, my friends, it's you, the patients, that rely on the NHS, and it fails to meet the necessary standards. It's you and me that suffers. So we went out on the streets and asked you, the British public, is the NHS in its current form fit for purpose? Have a watch.
We've recently, a year ago, changed from a doctor's surgery that was absolutely hopeless to a better one, but we're fortunate that we found one that actually does face-to-face appointments. But that's quite a rare thing these days.
My wife had been diagnosed with cancer 9 weeks ago, and the response by the National Health has been immense. She's had the operation, now she's undergoing her first term of chemo, so I can only say, you know, hats off to the NHS.
The people that work there, the facilities, are fit for purpose. What isn't fit for purpose is the funding and the political actions that make it not as fit for purpose as it should be.
The doctors and nurses are incredible. What needs to happen is they need to be properly remunerated for the services they give. We need to have the right number of them because what they do is incredible. They are heroes.
Joining me to discuss this is a panel of, well, they are experts. Top paramedic, good friend of mine, Steve Pratton, on the show. Thank you, NHS GP Dr Rachel Ward and private GP Dr Aaron Ghosh. One and all, thank you so much indeed. Rachel, I want to start with you. I know from talking about this in different segments on JK Live over the last year, naturally, NHS GPs want to defend the very concept of the NHS, and yet we come down to this whole debate about there's 153 billion, you've got one side of the argument that says this isn't enough, we need more. You've got the other side that says this is mismanagement, there are things happening that are not right. When you hear that gentleman Mathew's story about his mother, 76 years of age, paid a stamp all her life, I bet you, and in an undignified way, undignified was the word he uses, dies on the floor in her bedroom, basically gets an infection, dies 2 days later. What's your view of the NHS? Is it fit for purpose, yes or no?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. When you hear stories of people having those horrendous experiences, then you know that it is not functioning in a humane way. It's not functioning at that level of care that we want to offer. I think the concept of the NHS is still world leading, but at the moment it's not functioning in the way it should. We're not offering superb care to the patients that we want to offer. Somebody needs to be brave to admit this and to take it on and to look at the change. And I think that's one of the main problems, that nobody wants to admit this problem.
I think that's a very interesting point, Aaron, because, you know, the clamour for NHS 2.0 grows stronger every day. You know, as medical professionals, it wasn't set up with a population that would live as long as we now live. It certainly wasn't set up to cater for the numbers it now has to cater with. And there's another whole argument about who's allowed the service and who's not. Just strikes me as tragic that people like, you know, Matthew's mother don't get the help, having paid into it for years, that they damn well should get, Aaron.
And also, we've known that this crisis is going to happen. Yeah. So this planning hasn't just happened because of 5 years of bad organisation or one government. It's consecutive government poor planning and mismanagement with no long-term plan. And now we ended up in a crisis situation which COVID really, I think, exacerbated, but showed the world what situation the NHS was in. We didn't have enough ventilators. We didn't have enough beds. We suddenly had to make hospitals in car parks. Why, as one of the richest countries in the world, were we doing that? Because we had such poor planning.
Well, you talk about planning, and I'll come to you in a minute, Stevie, and I really appreciate you being on, because I will not have paramedics or ambulance men or women bashed, and we'll talk about that in a sec. Rachel, my local hospital in Windsor, this is an absolute fact. I think I might have said this to you before, Aaron. When COVID hit, and I'll name them, the Princess Margaret Hospital of Windsor, they paid, or the government paid this private hospital, £10 million for COVID beds. And the rest of the hospital was shrunk into 10%. The rest, 90%, was never used. They had 4 patients. That was £10 million that could be spent on that lady being taken off her bedroom floor. That's people's frustration, right?
Of course, I mean, there was also £4 billion spent on, unusable PPE, which was, yes, there was bad judgment and bad spending during COVID. And I think also there is this concept that, there is no more money to put into the NHS. We need to see this as something that is a long-term investment in the wealth and health of our nation. If we don't have healthy people, people don't work. Everything is just a domino effect. So, we talk about millions, and I appreciate, in individual basis, it's a large amount of money, but nationwide and for our nation's health, it's not. So we need to be looking at the bigger picture, how much we spend per head compared to other, similar countries, and what we're actually willing to put into our health.